Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture by our Axel Springer Fellow, Hugh Eakin, entitled, Is Culture Worth Saving? Art, Monuments, and Modern Warfare. Now, putting together the semester calendar here at the Academy, it can sometimes be a little like doing a Rubik's Cube blindfolded and underwater. Okay, sorry for the self-dramatization. But we do depend on the schedules of others, and we are constantly and of necessity reacting to changes in their calendars. And so sometimes we come up with weeks like this one, in which we started off with Scott Strauss's brilliant lecture on the failing project of genocide prevention, and end with Hugh Eakin and cultural destruction in war. It's that kind of period. But anyway, I do hope some of you at least caught our writer-in-residence, Colson Whitehead's talk last night, because that is precisely what you needed between those two slices of bread. And I have to say, it was also not, as the kids would say, it was also not on our bingo card that he would be speaking just a few days after someone got a heap of attention for threatening that a whole civilization will die tonight. Happily, that did not happen, but that was absolutely not what we had in mind. Let me just say a word about the fellowship. I want to thank the Springer SSA and its CEO, Matthias Döpfner, a longtime Academy trustee, for their dedicated support of the Academy. The Axel Springer Fellowship was initiated in 2003 with the express aim of promoting German-American dialogue in the fields of media, policy, and other areas of contemporary concern. And the generous support from Axel Springer has enabled us to host many fellows over the year. And just to name a few, we had Hugh Eakin's colleague from Foreign Affairs, Gideon Rose, just last year, legal scholar Ona Hathaway this fall, and journalist Deborah Amos just a few semesters ago. This semester's fellow, Hugh Eakin, is an editor-at-large at Foreign Affairs, where he commissions and edits essays and analysis on geopolitics, economics, law, and international politics. He has helped shape the magazine's outstanding coverage of the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, among other non-controversial subjects. Hugh holds a double BA, 2 BAs, from Harvard in Romance, Literature and Languages, and in History and Literature, which, with apologies to Professor Derek Penslar, is the very best concentration at Harvard. He also made the very long trek from one Cambridge to the other, from Massachusetts to England, and he holds an MPhil, a Master's of Philosophy in Political Thought and Intellectual History from the much older institution. Previously, he served as a contributing writer and senior editor at the New York Review of Books and founded NYR Daily, the review's online edition. He has reported from numerous countries in Europe and the Middle East and has written frequently on art and cultural heritage. Hugh's first book was the much acclaimed Picasso's War, How Modern Art Came to America, which came out in 2022. And it describes the decades-long struggle of those great modernists, art patron John Quinn and the path-breaking museum director Alfred Barr Jr., to transform 20th century American taste. And if you want to learn more about the reception of Picasso in the US, and especially about the groundbreaking Picasso 40 Years of His Art exhibition, which took place at the Museum of Metropolitan Art, at the Museum of Modern Art, in 1939, and how that launched Picasso in America, we recommend that you get your own copy of Hugh's book. from the book table in the lobby. There are a few other people's books there too, so please do peruse after the lecture. Hugh's essays and criticism have appeared in all the right places: the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Review of Books, of course, New York Times Book Review, Vanity Fair, and the New Yorker, among others. And if you have, and you should have, a New York Review of Books subscription, you should go and look up Hugh's 2018 article entitled "The Aesthetic Beauty of Brancusi," or as some people say, Brancusi. And you will be much better prepared than your fellow observer at the current exhibition at the Neue Nationalgalerie. Hugh has received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, back when they supported things, and the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Getty Research Institute, and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. I guess the money that years ago supported Hugh is now going, if you read the New York Times today, to support an enormous triumphal arch on the way into Washington, but we need not say any more about that. He is no stranger to Germany. He was a Fulbright scholar at Humboldt University in 2002, 2003. And while he's here at the Academy, he's working on his second book, tentatively entitled "Genocide by Other Means, Cultural Destruction and Why It Matters." The book will trace the connection between cultural and human violence in the 20th and 21st century. And tonight we will get a first look into his thinking. So I'm delighted that you're here to tell us all about it, Hugh, and welcome to the Academy podium.
Thank you. Ganz herzlichen Dank. In the spring of 1921, one of Turkey's top generals was a man named Kazim Karabakir. Now, this is the moment when Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, is consolidating the new Turkish state out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. And he's kicking out the Greeks from Smyrna. He's pushing back on the Allied imposed borders at Versailles. And he sent his general, Karabakir, to the Far East to get the remnants of the Armenians out of the Turkish world. Now, over the previous 5 years, most of that task had already been accomplished. An estimated 1 million to 1.5 million Armenians were ruthlessly murdered and deported. Armenian communities all over the Anatolian Peninsula were wiped out and destroyed. But here in the spring of 1921, Karabakir has one more chance to take this eliminationist campaign further. He approaches this remarkable site in the far eastern Anatolia. This is Ani. It is the historical capital, the 10th century capital of the Armenian Empire. It's a marvelous place. Imagine a huge series of double-towered ramparts extending into the horizon. This was a site filled with Christian churches. The Armenians called it the city of 1,001 churches. Now, it's hard to overstate how important this city was to Armenian identity. Armenian women are often named Ani after this city. Even though it was abandoned, it had this status as the kind of Ur of Armenian identity. And so the Turks know this. And as Karabakir and his army approach the site, he receives an order from the leadership in Ankara. And I quote, "The relics and traces of Ani must be wiped off the face of this earth. You will be rendering a great service to Turkey." Now, this is one of the more chillingly direct statements I've ever come across of cultural destruction serving the intent of disappearing a culture. In effect, the Turks, having killed as many Armenians as they could, were now saying, let's get rid of the traces, the historic traces of their existence. But then something remarkable happens. What does Karbakir do? He refuses the order. He leaves Ani intact. Now, it might be tempting to say that this is a kind of a footnote to a story of tragedy. No Armenians were saved in this decision by this Turkish general. The genocide happened. I would like to argue tonight that this decision was more important than we may think, and also more common. But before I do that, I want to go through a few of the classic cases of what cultural destruction is. What do we mean by cultural destruction? What are its forms? And I think we can go through history and talk about different moments in time and different forms of cultural destruction. Starting with up until the end of the 19th century, I think colonialism, we have around the world examples of massive military force being used on indigenous cultures, sometimes to terrifying effect. One was the British punitive raid on Benin in Africa in 1897. This was the source of the Benin bronzes entering collections, both in London and in parts of Europe. But move on to the 20th century, and it's really a different focus. The central focus, I think, of cultural destruction is now mechanized warfare. So these are the big wars of the 20th century. And this is the problem which in legal speak is called military necessity. So what do you do when you have a strategic goal that conflicts with a major cultural site? And this is the dilemma that was posed over and over again in World War I, in World War II, and many of the great debates about cultural destruction were centered around this. Monte Cassino Abbey was one of the most sort of tragic cases. Of course, many of you know this. This is the Allied, Eisenhower's decision to go ahead and destroy this site because they thought Germans were using it for defensive purposes. That was wrong. They were told it was wrong, but they went ahead and did it. Anyway, we move on to the 21st century, and a new face of cultural destruction emerges, and this I call extremism. You all remember the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. We had ISIS, and we had Ansar al-Din in Timbuktu. And this is one of the great mud brick mosques that was attacked with, I think, hammers and chisels in 2012. So this is a really different kind of destruction. This is low tech, bulldozers in bulldozers in Iraq, ISIS attacking Assyrian sites, and, hammers here. And I think if we step back and look at this trajectory, we also saw the emergence of a kind of a legal regime that was focused now on extremism. And for those of you who heard the lecture on Monday by Scott Strauss, he talked about this anti-atrocity regime that emerges starting in the late 90s up until this kind of positive moment in the build-out of international response. And the idea was yes, there was this last spasm of cultural destruction in the US-led invasion of Iraq. But after that moment, 2003, there really was a consensus that, okay, the West is going to do better rules of engagement. The US and the UK joined international agreements, and the main problem left to conquer was extremism. Well, that blissful moment has now shifted. Today, we're facing a very different situation. I'm just going to run through a quick series of examples. This is an entire archaeological museum in Yemen, wiped out by the Saudi Air Force in 2015. Africa's oldest mosque, shelled by Ethiopian Eritrean troops in 2021. The main Orthodox Cathedral of Odessa, struck by a Russian missile in July 2023. And Gaza, I'm not going to show images of the rubble that you've all seen. I think it's important to note that the cultural fabric of Gaza was overwhelmingly destroyed. And this includes contemporary art. This is a painting by a Palestinian painter, Sharif Sharan, at an art center in Gaza City. The center was destroyed, the art collection reduced to ashes. And then finally, just now, as we speak, in the last few weeks, this is Iran, and this is Isfahan. A historic palace, UNESCO World Heritage Site, has been severely damaged by a US strike. So a couple of things about these examples, and I could give many different ones from other places, but just take these 5. None of them are by extremist forces. All of them are by major military forces. Nearly all of them are aerial attacks. And if we look at the last 3, so the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the 40-day campaign in Iran, this is really a new kind of warfare that we're talking about. What do I mean by new kind of warfare? Well, we all have heard about the drone warfare. Well, drones have enabled Russia to launch up to, it was 500, but I think now it's 900 attacks in a 24-hour period. Along with drones, AI and algorithms and big data. And so this has been perfected by the Israelis and now the United States. You may have heard of there's an Israeli program called Lavender and Gospel. These are AI-aided programs that pick targets. And the US has new technology from Palantir and Anthropic. And what this has enabled is a pace of warfare that we have never seen before. So how many targets were hit in 40 days in Iran? The US, 13,000. I think the Israelis, something like 10,800. We're really about 24,000 in 40 days. That's 600 a day. That's, I think, and check my math, I think it's about 1 every 2.5 minutes. Now, no human can vet these sites, these targets, that when there are that many. And the result is, of course, a girls' school in Iran. And the first and foremost danger is civilian, but dense civilian centers are where cultural objects, cultural heritage, museums, libraries are, old palaces. And so we're in this new era where we're really in a crisis of cultural destruction. But before lest you think that that's the end of the things we need to worry about, I also want to talk about another kind of cultural damage that often isn't even considered with the things I'm talking about. And I call this cultural repression. And I think we're familiar with what's happened to Uyghur shrines in China, or another example could be Azerbaijan, where a lot of Armenian heritage has been quietly erased. These are places where cultural destruction happens in peacetime, out of public view, and things disappear. But this is not a problem of non-Western authoritarian regimes. This is happening in the heart of Europe, in the United States. And so I just want to give one example of this, which is Slovakia. And I know probably many of you don't follow cultural affairs in Bratislava, but since the right-wing coalition under Robert Fico came to power in 2023, he appointed a far-right cultural minister who has systematically wiped out, purged the cultural officials of every major institution in Bratislava. So by that, I mean not just the museums, but the National Theater, the National Library. Certain kinds of exhibitions have been banned. There's a kind of a concerted effort to rewrite what can be said and how it is said about Slovak history. So this is a very aggressive embrace of a kind of new history. And I don't think that this is an illustration of that from. I think it's a wonderful way of capturing it by a Slovak illustrator. It's just called Ministry of Culture, and you can see this Orwellian building with eyes on the roof and claws and jaws, and it's on fire. This is a kind of very dark view of culture. But I think we need to look at this carefully and take it seriously, because it's not just Slovakia. We've seen similar things happen in Hungary, in Poland. And I think I probably don't need to mention another country on the other side of the Atlantic over the past 15 months. And why should we care about these events in democratic countries where the leadership can change? Well, I think if you look historically, this is a very serious thing, that cultural repression lays the groundwork for human repression. And we can talk about that afterward. So having given this overview of our current dark situation, I think it's fair to ask, what can legal and policy instruments actually accomplish? And actually, I think the history here is much longer and richer than we often give it credit for. We may think that cultural protection is kind of a luxury. This is something that emerged in the post-war liberal construction of international law. And to a point, that's true. So the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict, this is actually the main instrument we have today. It's very imperfect. We can talk about it later. But the larger point here is that it was not the first, that we have been wrestling with this really since the beginning of the 20th century, if not earlier. And this includes not just legal efforts, but military efforts. The German Kunstschutz was founded right at the beginning of World War I, though subsequent history may suggest its limited effectiveness. Many different kinds of processes are happening, but I think what's interesting is to recover some of the ideas that we never did fully implement. And I'm just going to give a few examples here. So the Lieber Code, this is the very earliest case of a legal manual specifically protecting artwork in war. And interesting enough, where is this produced? In the United States during the American Civil War. And so this code was written by a man named Francis Lieber, who was a legal professor at Columbia and was asked to write a new military code for the Union Army in the middle of the Civil War. This is 1863. And in this code, he makes explicit, quote, classical works of art must be secured against all avoidable injury, even when they are contained in fortified places whilst besieged or bombarded. Now, this is really interesting in a number of ways. First of all, it's interesting that he's thinking about art. This is in the 1860s. There really aren't any American art museums. The Metropolitan Museum of Art hasn't been opened yet. It's still almost a decade away. There are few major art collections. There isn't a memory of spoliation as there would have been in Europe from previous wars. And he's also thinking about this problem of military necessity. Note that he says even when a military target is in play, the art inside needs to be protected. So this is a very far-sighted thing. So where does this come from? Well, it turns out that Francis Lieber was Franz Lieber. He was born in Berlin. He was a Prussian liberal. He fought as a teenager in the Battle of Waterloo, went on to volunteer in the Greek War of Independence, and then ended up in the United States, where he became a law professor and ultimately advisor to Lincoln. So he brought, I'm speculating here, but I think he brought the direct experience of European warfare and would have known about Napoleon's spoliations and the monuments in Greece that were directly in Athens caught up in the War of Independence. So this is one interesting example. Another, a completely forgotten document from the early 20s. This is called the 1923 Hague Rules of Warfare. Now, I already mentioned to you where warfare is today. Well, in the 1923, it was in its infancy. I mean, we're talking about airships. And yet a group of international jurists could see that air power posed a radically new form of warfare that threatened civilians and cultural sites. And they came up with these rules, and the rules explicitly identified mechanisms to protect culture. And so the concept here is that you have, land warfare, it's the front lines you're worried about. Now, air warfare, suddenly you can reach deep into enemy territory. You can attack cities. You can attack places that are far away from the front lines. And anywhere there's a church or a building or a museum, a library is fair game. So they had this idea that you would have no-go zones, designated cultural sites of great importance. Okay, this seems sort of pie in the sky. How are you going to do this? Well, they also thought up the problem that the defenders would use these sites for military installations, because you could then have this protected site. So their concept was, let's have cultural inspectors. So something like the nuclear inspectors we have today, an inspector regime that would enforce that these sites are only being used for cultural purposes. They would be established in peacetime, and then they would be off limits to war. Anyway, this is just an interesting concept, but I think it's worth pointing out that the members who signed it in 1923 included two Axis powers, so Italy and Japan, as well as the UK and the United States. Sadly, it never became a treaty, and we know the rest of the story. In World War II, of course, air power becomes extremely important as one of the most devastating parts of the war. The third example I want to bring up is familiar also from Scott's lecture on Monday, and this is Raphael Lemkin. But he's, of course, the father of the Genocide Convention of 1948. He's the guy that came up with the concept of genocide during World War II. I want to go back to some of his earlier ideas. So one of the things that's interesting about Lemkin is that from the beginning, he's thinking about culture. And he's also thinking about Armenia and what happened to the Armenians. Excuse me. And so when he first comes up with this idea of a crime against a collectivity, he doesn't even call it genocide yet. He still doesn't have a term for it. But in his early conception, he can see that there are crimes against a group that we haven't yet addressed. And these crimes can be physical crimes against a group of humans. They can also be against that group's culture. And so he writes, this is in 1933 in a policy paper, an attack targeting a collectivity, as he calls a group, can also take the form of systematic and organized destruction of art and cultural heritage. And he has this two-pronged idea of this new crime that he wants to identify. And he says barbarism, that's the crime against humans, and vandalism is the crime against culture. And he sees them as two parts of the same thing. Now, this remarkable idea finds proof only 4 years later, and this is Kristallnacht. And if ever there's a paradigmatic case of cultural destruction standing in and presaging human destruction, I think this is it. An organized, systematic effort to wipe out Jewish businesses, storefronts, homes, and of course, synagogues all over Germany and Austria. And you have at the same time the first roundups of Jewish citizens. So here, a recent German book actually called this the catastrophe before the catastrophe. This is a classic case of culture as early warning for human atrocity. But sadly, Lemkin's ideas were never taken up. And when the Genocide Convention finally happens, the cultural piece, to his chagrin, is left aside. So where does that leave us? We have these very innovative legal efforts in the early part of the century, but we can see that today, many of the most important ideas never made it into international law. We still have this question of how are we dealing with culture? Is it a central part of war? Is it its own? Or is it really just a sort of corollary thing? And I think this kind of impasse points to a different direction, which is that we need to really look organically at when does culture survive? When is art rescued? When do monuments not get destroyed? And here I think is really interesting. Looking across many wars, past and present, I've come up with a series of categories, and I'm glad I'm open to other categorizations, but this is what I would say. So we have one category is defying orders. We saw Karabakir at the city of Ani. Another great example of this is the new synagogue in Berlin. Some of you may know this story. What happened on the night of Kristallnacht to Berlin's most important synagogue? It didn't burn. It was set on fire, but the local police chief refused to follow orders and let it burn. He called the fire department and he sent away the SA men, and the new synagogue survived. Another category of protection that I have seen in numerous conflicts is what I will call credible authority. And what do I mean by this? I mean when a local, this often could be religious authority or someone with a lot of local clout, is able to persuade a community to not attack or destroy enemy culture that it controls. And a really fascinating case is the 1967 war and Israel's victory over the Arab states. So in this euphoric moment in June 1967, the Israelis recapture the old city of Jerusalem. And this is a euphoric moment, but is also extremely perilous. Why is it perilous? Because the old city in Jerusalem holds two of the most important sites in both religions. The Haram al-Sharif, which has the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome on the Rock. And of course, the Israeli Jews, the same site they call the Temple Mount. And this is the site of the historic temple. That's the most holiest site in Judaism. And having recaptured the site, there's enormous pressure here to reclaim it, but not only reclaim it. The flag goes up, the Israeli flag goes up on the Dome of the Rock. Here you see Israeli paratroopers entering the compound, and there are calls to blow up the Dome on the Rock. I mean, this is a serious moment. And of course, the overwhelming pressure is that people want to pray there. They want Jews want to be able to once again pray on the Temple Mount. And how do you resolve this explosive moment right at the heart of the entire conflict? Well, it wasn't political authority. It wasn't military authority, although both of those played a part. So the military was trying to counsel restraint. The Israeli political authority didn't want people to pray there, but how are they going to enforce this? The answer was religious authority. And this fascinating decision by 56 leading rabbis in Israel shortly after the victory, with this kind of exquisite Talmudic logic, they find that because the original site of the temple cannot be ascertained, Jews are forbidden to pray there. In this wonderful decision, it actually has credible authority. This is what has helped enforce what we call today the status quo, which is that the Islamic Waqt, the Jordanian Muslim Authority, is able to manage the site. Jews stay off it. And of course, you've heard endlessly about tensions here, but I think the remarkable thing is that it's still there. Here you have, this is a week ago, April 9th, 2026. These are Muslims arriving for morning prayer before dawn at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So a third and final kind of rescue that I would like to describe is what I just call local action. And what I mean by this is individuals taking courageous action on their own or with very modest support to rescue culture that they are very attached to, that is in imminent danger. What do I mean by this? Well, a great example is Timbuktu, when librarians rescued medieval Islamic manuscripts, local librarians, in this amazing evacuation. There are many examples of this. The one that I find very searing is Palmyra, Syria, 2015. We all know the story of ISIS ravaging the temples of Palmyra. But in the run-up to these events in May 2015, this remarkable figure, Khalid al-Assad, he's no relation to the Assads. He's the the local archaeologist who was born at Palmyra, grew up there, and for more than, I think, 50 years, managed this site. He organized an evacuation of every movable piece that he could before ISIS got there, and he refused to leave the site. Now, he wanted to confront the attackers and persuade them to leave it untouched. Sadly, he was taken and hideously murdered. And I want to be clear here, I don't want to be advocating martyrdom to protect culture, but I think his case is so important in showing the power of local attachment to culture and commitment that can never be replicated by international force. And so we have these three kinds of rescue, and I think that they offer some degree of hope and maybe some programmatic ideas for how we can harness them more in wars. But I think the larger picture is that a huge amount of destruction is happening, let's face it. And this brings me to a final kind of rescue, which I want to call cultural rescue. What do I mean by this? Well, we all know Guernica. We think of as this great 20th century anti-war, great sort of universal statement against war. But before it was universal, it was specific. It was about a very specific atrocity. In fact, it was about a specific atrocity that was an absolutely new form of warfare. This was the aerial bombardment of Guernica, the Basque city, by the Condor Legion. And some of you may know this story, but it was a very carefully planned new kind of attack where waves of alternating aircraft, I think Hinkels and Junkers, dropping incendiary explosives in an effort to set the entire city on fire, was planned for a market day when as many people as possible would be killed. Some people were strafed with gunfire. And it left a model of destruction that was both terrifying to other European powers and also galvanizing, I guess you could say. This introduced a new form of warfare, aerial destruction of cities. And I think that is what we need to have in mind when we look at Guernica. One of the things we need to have in mind, and this picture also records another important specific moment, which this is 1939, the Museum of Modern Art. This is when Guernica arrives in the United States for the first time. So it's also representative of another rescue that happened, and this is the rescue of modern art, much of which ends up in the United States. And because of the war, energizes a new modern art culture in the United States, including many modern artists who escape from Europe. So that's one kind of cultural rescue. It gets a bit more complicated when you have monuments that themselves embody a kind of cultural erasure. And what do I mean by this? Well, this is the monument to the Civil War Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. This is the day it was dedicated in Charlottesville, Virginia, 1921. This is not a monument about the Civil War. This is a monument about white power in the South in the 1920s. This is a monument about erasing a history that the white power in the South couldn't acknowledge. And this was the lost cause. As we know today, this became an incredibly charged legacy in the 2010s. And there was this moment when Civil War monuments, Confederate monuments were being dismantled in different parts of the country. These were generally communal decisions, city councils deliberating on this and deciding to take them down. Charlottesville was one of the places. And what happened when that decision was made? Well, we had the white supremacist march in 2017. And that ended in violence, terrible violence. And so the legacy of that was the Jackson Monument had to go. But what do you do with a monument like this? Do you destroy it? Do you make it disappear? And the problem is, of course, it's history. It's part of the history. And the remarkable decision here, the cultural rescue, was Kara Walker. And the picture may not do this justice, but so we know Kara Walker. I think many of you know her two-dimensional cutouts, which do a sort of incredible confrontation with the most sort of traumatic parts of American history. Here, she takes the Stonewall Jackson Monument and reconfigures it. What is the word for it? She has reassembled it in the same way that she does her cutouts. I think it's very, and it both de-dangers the monument from its initial its earlier story, but it also captures the history that is there. It is an act that is destructive, but it does not erase. And she puts this very well. She said, the act of reclaiming the sculpture required an act of butchery. But it doesn't include erasure. The history is there. In fact, I think, as she also said, it's louder than it's ever been before. The sword is being dragged across the battlefield. It's still a rider on a horse in some fashion. It's been completely processed as part of this dangerous history. So the other thing that's really interesting to me is that she calls this work Unmanned Drone, which I think is a powerful statement of its own about the power and violence of our time. Now, on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Poland, Hitler told a group of his top Wehrmacht officers, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. The logic here, I think, to all of us is unmistakable. For Nazi Germany, here was a model of how to eliminate an unwanted people and get away with it. But as we know today, Hitler was wrong. This is Ani, a recent photograph of the walls of Ani. In 2016, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It still stands. The Armenians are remembered. And if you ask Armenians, they would say this story is not finished. It's an imperfect end. The site is still on the Turkish side of a closed border, the border between Turkey and Armenia. Armenians can't visit. The site does not fully tell the Armenian story of its past, but the monuments survive. I would like to think that just maybe it beckons to a different future. It leaves open the possibility of an act of cultural rescue, which I hope will someday take place when Armenia and Turkey reconcile. Thank you very much. I'm glad to take questions and really curious what you think of some of the ideas I've tried to put across. I also want to mention quickly that this book is available outside. Please take a look. But it's not just me. I think I have the rare honor of being on the same table as Colson Whitehead, and a few other fascinating books. I think Maza's book is out there. Please take a look. But anyway, go ahead.
Hugh, great talk. I wonder if there's a category of self-restraint, and maybe I have the story wrong, but my understanding is that the United States during World War II didn't bomb Kyoto because of concerns about destruction of the temples and what impact that might have on Japanese willingness to surrender. That story, maybe it's not true, but Is there some times when militaries choose not to attack a cultural target because they're afraid what it would do to their capacity to fight or the adversary's capacity to resist?
Yes, that's a great question and a great example. Yes, indeed. we didn't do Kyoto. We decided that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were better targets. It's a complicated story, and don't quote me on the details. I believe that I can't remember the figure who is at the center of this, that his wife knew Kyoto, and it was we don't want to destroy that stuff. I think that you're right, that this does have a powerful effect, and one of the, I think, goals of UNESCO in designating World Heritage Sites is to say, look, these are beyond any one country. These are important to humanity, and therefore we all should care about their destruction, and that it should give any military pause. I think the real problem is that at least as that is played out today, is that the UNESCO World Heritage Sites over and over again are getting hammered. I mean, Odessa, the center of Odessa, is a World Heritage Site that's been hammered by Russian missiles. Isfahan, and many other examples. So it's a great point. I don't sort of have an answer to that of whether it works or not, and I would be curious if there were more to look more closely at that. Sabrina.
Thanks so much, Hugh. There's so much in common between our presentations. This is very, very great to see. So I'm curious because in so many of your examples, the saving of the culture comes after mass killing of civilians. So is there so, and it seems kind of paradoxical. So why, on one hand, we're killing people, but saving the culture or saving artifacts that are related? Is there some kind of difference in value? Like, how do you reconcile that kind of difference?
Well, I think the Armenian case is unusual in that respect, that this is happening at the very end. I think actually more often that it's at the beginning. And I think this is really interesting. I mean, what I said, the early warning, because you also have cultural policies that often lay the ground for this, and they may not start with destruction. They may be bans. Think back to 1933 in Germany. It began with culture, not with war or military force. There were, purges of museum officials, university officials. Art was taken down. Certain kinds of architecture were banned. This started in 33. That was what came first. Even earlier, I think even in the late Weimar period, when you have contesting power, where the Nazis come to power regionally, they're putting in cultural policies. So I think it happens early on very often, and I may not have made that point clear. I don't have an answer for this more complicated situation that you describe. Yes, I think that this is the familiar accusation. This is what the leader of the Taliban said when he blew up the Bamiyan Buddhists. Well, you guys only care about this stuff. What about our people? This is a dilemma.
I just wanted to reiterate a point that you made. It's very fascinating to see this all in this one framework of thinking. I think in the most recent conflicts, Ukraine and Gaza, it's quite obvious that the cultural destruction is part of the campaign, is at the core of the reason for going to war, because the Ukrainian people are not to be existed, right? So it's actually far away from the Geneva Convention. It's actually an integral part of the campaigns in the war. And that said, an additional thought, there's a lot of effort in rebuilding Palmyra, other things. There's Alif, there's a lot of international coalitions that actually work hard to rebuild this. So how does this fit into your thinking? Is it okay to rebuild, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It gets into a whole other debate, but Timbuktu is a great example. In Timbuktu, they've decided basically to rebuild everything. And that is an approach that 20 years ago, especially in European countries, would not have been followed. I think there was, the sort of the reigning thinking in sort of historical preservation And I'm not an expert on this. This is just my understanding. But the reigning thinking was you want to preserve the scars of the past, which makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, there's a great example of this in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich was rebuilt in a really sensitive way after World War II. And you can see those war injuries in the reconstruction. I think that is just hugely important. It's the history that we don't want Disney World. That said, I think it's also the local community that has a say. And I don't know the story of Timbuktu well enough to understand how much of that was local. That's what they wanted. And I know that non-Western cultures have different ideas about what constitutes the essence of what they are saving. Temples in China often get rebuilt over and over and over again, and they're still historic temples. So I think it may be a question of there is no one answer.
My name is Bill Foreman. Thank you very much for a very anregende talk. What you've described, the destruction that happens before the human destruction, the cultural destruction, seems to be part of a demonization that is necessary in the expedience of war. That first thing you have to do is demonize your opponents, which you do culturally. Are there any serious attempts to get in the way of that process when conflicts are being threatened? Because it seems everything else after the fact will be, doesn't really help in hindsight to maybe help something.
If I'm understanding you, are you asking, is when we have these early warning signs, is there something we can do? Is that the
That's
yeah,
good.
yeah. No, I think that's great, and I mean it's interesting that in fact there is early warning research about human atrocities, what high risk countries for that, and it would be interesting. And I haven't looked at this carefully. Do those kinds of monitoring take account of cultural forces? But it's a dilemma, and this goes back to the Lemkin question, which is that essentially if you have a concept of genocide that is not tied to war, but really just wherever it happens, whenever it happens, it means that you have to be able to violate sovereignty. You have to be prepared to intervene. And I think that question hasn't really been resolved. I'm not a legal specialist, but that's my sense of it. So it's a continual dilemma. Oh, sorry.
Hugh, thank you. That was a terrific talk. Thank you so much. I was going to ask a related question, which is about the sequence that you talked about with the precursor to genocide being vandalism. And it put me in mind of Heine's comment about the burning of books and the burning of bodies. And what comes before the burning of books is the banning of books. And so I was wondering where censorship fits into your studies here, whether that's being factored in as already an incredible warning sign of what might follow.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was trying to get at a little bit in talking about cultural repression. I mean, I'm not predicting a terrible human event in Slovakia, but I think that it is important to take very seriously the ways that culture is being weaponized now and understood as a weapon, and it seems quite clear. And it's a kind of playbook that is. It's not just by accident that we're seeing this intense interest in taking over, limiting censorship, what people can say. A lot of it has to do with how you talk about national history. We saw that in Poland with the silencing of certain kinds of historical discussion about the Holocaust in Poland. We're seeing it in the United States with discussion about slavery, efforts to censor from historical sites, national historical sites, mention of the fact of slavery, the bringing back Christopher Columbus. I mean, these are all aspects of, I think, a larger program that we need to take seriously as a first stage of what could happen.
many of the episodes that are familiar to some of us involve bombing, decisions made in the heat of battle. I think of Dresden, the bombing of Berlin, Coventry, the debate about Tokyo, and so forth. I mean, these are the upfront parts of our story, or our common story. I think it might be a wonderful, if it hasn't been done already, book or PhD thesis is to look where, if I can use the expression, the rubber hits the road. That is to say, at the targeting decisions made by generals during various episodes, wartime episodes, thinking in particularly of a recent book I've read about the Italian campaign and the debate amongst generals about what do we do about Monte Cassino.
Yeah.
And the extent to which that involved personalities, the gossip about American generals and the decisions they made, and that to me would be
it's absolutely essential, and I think that we need to be reminded that it's often one or two people that are making these decisions.
Yes.
Adam's question about Kyoto. I mean, this was a single person, I think, in the White House saying no, or we can't do this. So yes, that is absolutely interesting and essential. But I also have to say that what I'm worried about today is when non-humans are choosing targets, and what does that look like? Stephen.
Yeah, Hugh, thanks. That was great. I think, re-ask Sabrina's question. What is it that inhibits a person who's willing to murder individuals to not destroy an artifact? I mean, is it because it represents something like human longevity after life? Is it something about the uniqueness of the thing, that it can't ever be recreated? Or what is it that would allow someone who has a genocidal attitude toward human life, or inhibit them from destroying a work of art?
All I can think of is that Hitler went to Florence in, I think, like 1938, and the destruction of Florence was never really on the table after that. You know, they tragically blew up the Ponte San Trinita, but
So why? What is it about Florence?
He saw it. He saw it. He was there. He had some recognition. I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I do think that, I mean, and I would love to know why Karabekir makes that decision. He records this in his memoirs. I don't read Turkish, but I've tried to understand this, but he really doesn't explain why he makes his decision. So
I would say, Kant has the distinction between dignity and price. So things have a price, humans have dignity. And somehow this is the reverse. It's as if these objects have a dignity that lifts them up above human life, strangely, I mean, oddly or mysteriously, I guess.
Dan.
Yeah, Hugh, great and provocative talk. A comment and a question. The comment is just that Academy trustee Volker Schlondorf made a great movie on exactly this issue about the German general's decision not to blow up Paris. And so I recommend
the diplomat, right?
Diplomacy.
Or diplomacy,
something
yeah.
like that. So would you give us a thumbnail sketch of the history of the sort of official efforts to create a taboo around the destruction of culture in war? We spoke on Monday about how the Holocaust created so much movement on so many issues, including genocide prevention. The Hague Convention, which you mentioned, was
1954, yeah.
I was looking it up today. I saw that we signed it. The U.S.
Yes,
signed it.
after Iraq.
No, we signed it on the day that it was open for signature.
But we ratified it.
Have we ratified it?
2009.
Oh, it's interesting because on the website we haven't ratified it yet.
Maybe they've unratified it.
Yeah, but and then there's the protocols for the Second Geneva Convention, in the 70s, and I'm unaware of what's happened since and whether there's any movement to strengthen the taboo, given all the extraordinary and horrible things that have happened, or is this something that the countries have just said it's just a bridge too far?
I think this goes down to that depressing end of that arc of hope that also Scott Strauss sketched out. That so in the 2000s and the 2010s, yes, it seemed like this was suddenly, because of these extremist attacks, which were very low tech. I think they were terrifying. They were images that were ubiquitous in Western media, and there was a sense of obligation, I think, stemming from the recent memory of what had happened in the Yugoslav wars, in Iraq. And the U.S. joined this cultural treaty, and so did the U.K., I think even later in 2017. The problem with this, of course, is where we are now. And I think that we're at a time where the question of taboos, I don't know. I would just like to recall to you that in the first Trump administration, this is after the assassination of Soleimani, there is this very tense moment where Trump threatens to blow up a bunch of cultural sites in Iran. And a bunch of his generals have to say, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. And, I don't know in that situation whether we have those people today that would tell him that.
Thank you, Hugh. I would like to pick up on your last point on when President Trump threatened to blow up a few sites in Iran in about 2018 or 19. It was, and I remember exactly at the same moment, the district attorney of Manhattan decided the restitution of Operation Relief to Iran. So Operation Relief, which had been looted years ago. It was just a coincidence of time, of course, but I found the coincidence really interesting and showing that the USA is multiple, actually. It's not just a president, you also have a justice system, robust, in New York, and we have a very efficient, you know him probably, Matthew Bogdanos, district attorney. And I found this really amazing. Another thing I would like to ask you related to that is how do you articulate the awareness of the public on looting and on destruction with the awareness of looting? Because today many sites are not only destroyed but looted. The Islamic State was not only destroying but mostly looting to make money. How do we articulate both causes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I actually maybe I'm more optimistic than some. I feel like in the matter of looting, we have made progress. There are real standards now that many, very few museums now will go near objects, Western museums at least, that do not have really airtight provenance, because there has been so much bad history there with objects that were looted and had to be repatriated. I mean, no museum wants to have to get something and then have to give it back. So I think that is an area where there has been real progress, not to say that it doesn't happen in terrible ways today, but I think that is something that is maybe separate from actual destruction. And, I'm hopeful that, we can reach a point where we don't have to, you can never, I don't know. I mean, I guess this is like illegal goods that at a certain point, if somebody is buying them, it will still happen. But at least if you can get, universal institutional agreement not to buy objects, that there's hope that is can make progress. Over here.
2 more questions.
First of all, thank you very much. It was intriguing. Throughout history, I think that civilization used to do this over and over again. I think that even one of the images that you showed was the Al-Aqsa built over the temples in Jerusalem. Okay, so that was part of civilization. That was part of how things were done, and new things raised from the ruins. So there is some kind of purpose in this kind of action. Do you think that today we are doing really better than they used to be before? Because I think that, well, there is awareness today, okay? And I think that we're doing much more considerate actions to preserve things. And I think that what you showed was like pinpointing a few incidents. But altogether, usually when one country is taking power over another country, they just eliminate everything, most of the cases. So I think we're making very good progress here. And
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
the question, if you think that we're really
We've made any progress since. Yeah. One would like to think. I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I mean, again, what's interesting to me in doing this research is how to the kind of converse. So if you go back in time, how aware certain people were about these issues very early on in the 19th century, even earlier. And so I think we can sort of complacently think, oh, we've come a long way from the bad old days. But I think that actually some of those early ideas were really interesting, and it's very hard to say that, oh, all the bad stuff happened before our time. Anyway, not a very good answer, but okay, last.
Well, that is perhaps the last question. Thank you very much for an inspiring talk. I'm very curious about the book you are writing. What does come out of this book? What is exactly the message? Is it?
I'm curious too.
Well, we felt that. So, is it an historical analysis of certain cases, or is this some kind of message? Can we do something about it?
You will have to read it when it comes out.